Hello everyone, I am the storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel also. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. Story 1. The Silent Passenger, a horror story by ChatGPT. The rain drummed against the windshield as Mark adjusted his rearview mirror. It was past midnight, and he had been driving for hours. His shift as a rideshare driver was nearly over, and he was eager to get home. The neon glow of the city lights blurred through the rain, casting eerie reflections on the wet asphalt. His phone pinged with a new ride request. Pickup location: Pinewood Cemetery. Mark hesitated. Who in their right mind would call for a ride from a cemetery at this hour? He exhaled sharply, shaking off the unease. It was just another fare, and he needed the money. He tapped accept and turned the car toward the cemetery. When he arrived, the place was deserted. A dense fog clung to the tombstones, swirling in ghostly tendrils. The streetlights flickered. Then he saw the passenger. A tall, slender man stood under an old oak tree, dressed in an outdated black suit. His skin was pallid, almost grey. He carried no umbrella, yet he appeared dry despite the rain. His face was expressionless. Mark unlocked the doors, glancing back uneasily. The man slid into the back seat without a word. "Where to?" Mark asked, forcing a casual tone. The passenger didn't respond. Instead, a cold draft swept through the car, making Mark shiver. "Sir," Mark tried again. A dry whisper filled the car. "Drive." Mark swallowed hard and put the car in gear. As they drove, the silence grew suffocating. Mark glanced at the rearview mirror. The passenger sat rigidly, his hollow eyes fixed straight ahead. Mark tried again. "So, been out late?" No answer. Mark's stomach twisted. Something about this man felt wrong. He couldn't hear him breathing. There was no sound of shifting fabric, no subtle movements, nothing. It was as if the passenger wasn't there at all. The city gave way to a dark highway. The rain intensified, hammering against the car like ghostly fingers. Then the temperature dropped. Mark exhaled, watching his breath fog up the air. It was freezing, far too cold for early autumn. He turned up the heater, but the chill remained. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, and then he smelled it. A faint, rotting stench filled the car. It was sickly sweet, like decaying flesh. Mark gagged. "Jesus, do you smell that?" Silence. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He checked the mirror again. The passenger was gone. Mark's stomach lurched. His eyes darted to the back seat. Empty. The seatbelt lay unfastened, the leather dry and untouched. A chill crawled up his spine. Had he imagined it? His fingers trembled as he gripped the wheel. He had seen the man get in. The wind howled outside. Lightning flashed. And in that split second, the mirror reflected something. The passenger, sitting directly behind him, watching. Mark's breath hitched. He slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching against the wet road. Panting, he spun around. The seat was empty again. His chest rose and fell rapidly. Was he losing his mind? Then a whisper, so close it tickled his ear. "Keep driving." Mark's blood turned to ice. His knuckles went white on the steering wheel. He stomped on the accelerator, desperate to reach civilization. But the road stretched endlessly into darkness. No street signs, no exits. His phone screen flickered. The navigation app glitched, the map twisting into unreadable symbols. Then, a single notification appeared. Estimated arrival. Unknown. Mark's pulse hammered. He checked the mirror again. The passenger's face was inches from his. A grotesque grin split his lips. His skin was no longer smooth but cracked, revealing blackened flesh beneath. His hollow eyes burned with something ancient. Mark screamed. The car jerked violently. He lost control, the wheels spinning wildly. The headlights illuminated something ahead. A cliff. The car veered toward the edge. A force grabbed Mark's hands, wrenching the wheel. The car spun, and everything went black. Mark gasped awake. Rain pelted his face. He was outside, lying on the wet pavement. His car gone. The road gone. He was in the cemetery. He scrambled to his feet, heart hammering. His breath came in ragged gasps as he checked his phone. Last ride completed. His car was nowhere in sight. Shaking, he turned. There, under the old oak tree, stood the passenger. His black suit was dry despite the downpour. His eyes met Mark's, empty, abyssal voids. Then he spoke. "You brought me home." Mark staggered back, but his legs wouldn't move. The cold seeped into his bones. The passenger lifted a skeletal hand and pointed. Mark turned and saw his own body lying in the wreckage of his car at the bottom of the cliff. A silent scream tore through him as darkness swallowed the world. And then, nothing. Epilogue. Another ride. The rain continued to fall. A rideshare driver pulled up to Pinewood Cemetery. His phone buzzed with a new request. He glanced at the app. Pickup location, Pinewood Cemetery. A man in a black suit stood under the old oak tree. The driver unlocked the doors. The passenger slid in. "Where to?" the driver asked. The man's lips curled into a smile. "Drive." Story 2. The room with no exit. James had never believed in ghosts. He was a man of reason, a skeptic who dismissed urban legends and ghost stories as mere entertainment. So when his best friend Daniel dared him to spend one night in the abandoned Blackwood Manor, James scoffed and accepted without hesitation. Blackwood Manor had a dark history. Built in the late 1800s, it was once home to the wealthy Blackwood family, until one night in 1923, the entire family vanished without a trace. The house had remained empty ever since, its reputation growing as a place of supernatural horror. Locals whispered about people who entered and were never seen again. But James wasn't afraid. He packed a flashlight, a few snacks, and a notebook, determined to document his experience and prove once and for all that the stories were nothing more than myths. At exactly 9 p.m., he stepped through the front door. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of rotting wood and dust. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. With every step, his heart pounded, not from fear, but from anticipation. Then he saw it, a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. Unlike the rest of the house, which was cloaked in dust and decay, this door looked pristine, almost new. Intrigued, James pushed it open and stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him. James spun around, his flashlight trembling in his grip. He reached for the doorknob and twisted. It didn't budge. "Okay, very funny, Daniel," he called out, assuming his friend had followed him inside to play a prank. Silence. James sighed and turned to examine the room. It was completely empty. No furniture, no windows, just 4 grey walls and a smooth wooden floor. The only light came from the bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering weakly. Something about the air in the room felt wrong. It was heavy, pressing against his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He walked around, running his hands along the walls. No seams, no hidden doors, no exit. He checked the ceiling, the floor, even the light fixture. Nothing. A wave of unease crept over him. He pulled out his phone. No signal. Then the light bulb flickered again. This time, it went out. Darkness swallowed the room. James's breath hitched. He fumbled for his flashlight and turned it on. The beam of light cut through the blackness, only to reveal something that hadn't been there before. A figure stood in the corner of the room. James's blood turned to ice. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. James took a step back, pressing himself against the door. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. He aimed the flashlight directly at the figure, but instead of illuminating it, the light seemed to bend around it, refusing to touch it. Then it twitched. A low, guttural sound filled the room, like a whisper reverberating through hollow bones. The walls trembled. The air grew colder. James felt something unseen brush against his arm. He scrambled for the door again, pounding against it with all his strength. "Let me out," he screamed. A deep, rasping voice echoed around him. "There is no exit." James spun around. The figure was closer, much closer. Its face was still hidden in darkness, but he could feel its gaze piercing through him. His body locked in place, paralyzed by an overwhelming force. The shadows in the room writhed and coiled around him, as if they were alive. And then the whispering started. Voices, dozens of them, hissing, crying, pleading. Some screamed in agony, others begged for release. James clutched his head, his mind unraveling under the weight of the voices. He shut his eyes and tried to block them out. But the moment he did, icy fingers wrapped around his throat. His eyes snapped open. The figure was right in front of him. James couldn't breathe. The grip around his neck tightened, dragging him down into the shadows. He struggled, kicked, clawed at the invisible force, but it was useless. The darkness swallowed him whole. And then, silence. When James opened his eyes, the room was gone. He was standing in a vast, empty void. Shapes moved in the distance, distorted, broken figures, their faces twisted in expressions of eternal suffering. He turned in a slow circle, heart hammering. Then he saw them. People, trapped behind invisible walls, their hands pressed against the unseen barrier, their mouths moving in silent screams. And in the reflection of the void, James saw himself. He was no longer whole. His body was fading, dissolving into the darkness. His own hands pressed against the invisible barrier just like the others. He was trapped forever. And outside the manor, the door to the room creaked open once again, waiting for the next visitor. Story 3. The voice behind you. Ethan had always been skeptical about ghost stories. As a freelance photographer, he had traveled to abandoned places, ruined buildings and eerie forests, capturing their haunting beauty through his lens. But he never believed in the supernatural until that night. He had received a request from a magazine to take photographs of Blackwood Manor, an old mansion deep in the forest. The house had been abandoned for over 50 years, and the locals whispered about the strange deaths that had occurred inside. But Ethan didn't care. A job was a job. The sun had already set when he reached the manor. His car headlights illuminated the overgrown path leading to the front door. The house stood tall, its windows dark and empty, like the eyes of something long dead but still watching. As he stepped inside, a strange feeling washed over him. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the house had been waiting for someone to disturb its silence. Then, as he set up his camera, he heard it. A whisper, software, cold, right behind him. "Get out." Ethan spun around, his heart slamming against his ribs. The hallway was empty. His breath came in quick gasps. It had to be the wind, he told himself. Just the wind. But deep inside, something told him he was wrong. Determined to finish his work, Ethan continued taking photos. He walked into the grand hall, its chandelier covered in cobwebs. As he adjusted his camera, he heard it again. "You're not alone." The whisper was closer this time, almost as if it were brushing against his ear. Ethan clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. He turned slowly, scanning the room. Still, nothing. He exhaled, shaking his head. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you." But as he raised his camera to take another shot, he saw something in the reflection of the shattered mirror. A dark figure, standing right behind him. His blood turned to ice. He spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, yet the whispering continued. "Why did you come?" The words slithered into his mind, sending chills down his spine. His hands trembled as he grabbed his camera and flashlight. He needed to leave, but as he reached the front door, it slammed shut on its own. A sharp, bone-chilling laugh echoed through the house. Panic gripped Ethan's chest as he pounded on the door. It wouldn't budge. His breath was ragged, his body trembling. Then the lights flickered. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched unnaturally, twisting and writhing like living things. He felt them watching. And then the whispers became voices. A chorus of distorted, agonized voices filled the house, overlapping, crying, whispering. "Help us. He won't let us go. Run while you can." Then a different voice, deeper, colder, cut through the others. "You're mine now." Ethan felt a pressure on his shoulders, like invisible hands gripping him. He struggled, but his body felt paralyzed. Through the dim light, he saw something emerging from the shadows. A tall, faceless figure, its body shifting like smoke, moving toward him. It whispered again, "Look behind you." Against his will, Ethan's head turned slowly, and he screamed. The next morning, Ethan's car was found abandoned outside Blackwood Manor. The doors were open, the engine still warm. But Ethan was gone. His camera was discovered inside the house, lying in the dust. The last photo taken showed something horrifying. A blurred, shadowy figure standing behind him, its mouth wide open, whispering into his ear. And at the bottom of the image, written in smeared black ink, were two final words. "Still here." Story 4. The Hand in the Darkness. The night was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Emily Parker gripped the steering wheel tightly as her car's headlights carved through the darkness of the forest road. The GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and she was certain she had taken a wrong turn somewhere. She had been driving for hours, trying to reach her friend Rachel's cabin for a weekend getaway, but now all she could see were endless trees stretching into the night. Then, out of nowhere, the car's engine sputtered, the lights flickered, and with one final cough, the engine died. "Crap," Emily muttered, pulling out her phone. No signal, of course. Stepping out of the car, she wrapped her coat around herself and looked around. In the distance, through the dense forest, she saw a faint glow. A house. Maybe someone there had a phone or could help her. With no other choice, Emily started walking. As she got closer, the house loomed larger. An old Victorian-style mansion, its windows dark and lifeless except for the dim light from one room. The air felt heavy, charged with something unexplainable. She hesitated but then knocked on the door. For a long moment nothing happened. Then, creak, the door slowly swung open by itself. "Hello," Emily called out. No answer. A gust of wind pushed against her back, almost urging her inside. The hallway was lined with old paintings of people with hollow, staring eyes. Dust clung to the furniture, and the air smelled of decay. A staircase spiraled up into darkness, and at the far end of the hall, a single door stood slightly ajar. That was where the light was coming from. Emily stepped inside cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. The house felt abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. She pushed the door open wider and stepped into the dimly lit room. A single candle flickered on a wooden desk, illuminating an old, leather-bound book. The pages were yellowed with age, covered in strange symbols. As she reached out to touch it, slam! The door behind her shut violently. Emily spun around, heart pounding. The candle flickered wildly, and suddenly the shadows in the room seemed to move, shifting unnaturally. A whispering sound filled the air, low, incomprehensible, coming from all around her. Then she saw it, a hand, pale and skeletal, emerging from the darkness beneath the desk. The fingers were long, bony, with jagged black nails. It crawled forward, as if searching. Emily gasped and stumbled backward, knocking over the candle. The flame went out, plunging the room into total darkness. And then, something grabbed her ankle. She screamed, kicking frantically, her foot colliding with something solid yet wrong. It felt like flesh, but was cold and damp, like something that had been dead for a long time. Scrambling to her feet, she ran for the door, yanking it open. She didn't stop to look back. She didn't care what that thing was. She just needed to get out. But the hallway was different now. Longer, twisting in ways that defied logic. The portraits on the walls had changed. Now the figures in them had wide, gaping mouths as if screaming. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she ran down the hall, but the whispers followed her, growing louder, more frantic. And then, a hand shot out from the darkness ahead. It was the same skeletal hand reaching for her, clawing at the air. Emily skidded to a stop, heart hammering. She turned to run the other way, but now there were more hands. Dozens. Crawling from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The whispers turned into voices. You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have touched the book. The air turned freezing cold. A shadow loomed at the end of the hall. A tall, misshapen figure, its face hidden in darkness. But Emily could feel its eyes on her, watching, waiting. And then, the voices spoke in unison. Join us. Something yanked her backward. Emily screamed as the hands pulled her down into the darkness. Cold, claw-like fingers wrapped around her arms, her legs dragging her deeper into the abyss. She fought, kicked, clawed at the floor, but the shadow swallowed her whole. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the book, lying open on the floor, its pages flipping by themselves. Then silence. A week later, Rachel finally arrived at the cabin, expecting to find Emily already there, but the place was empty. No sign of her. The police found Emily's car abandoned on the forest road, the door still open. They searched for days, but there was no trace of her. And the house. There was no house in the woods. There had never been one. But deep in the forest, hidden beneath layers of dead leaves and twisted roots, an old leather-bound book lay open. Its pages fluttered in the wind, and from the shadows, a pale, skeletal hand reached out once more. The end. Story 5. The Girl Who Never Sleeps. It started with whispers. Soft, almost inaudible at first, slipping through the walls of the old boarding house like a draft. Nobody paid much attention to it, until the screaming began. No one knew her real name. To everyone, She was simply the girl who never sleeps. Madeline arrived at the boarding house just after dusk, dragging a battered suitcase behind her. It had taken hours to find a place that would accept someone with barely any money to her name. The landlady, a gaunt woman with hollow eyes, had only one rule: don't disturb the girl in room 309. Madeline frowned. What do you mean? The landlady sighed. She doesn't sleep. She doesn't eat. She just exists. If you hear noises, ignore them. If you see her in the hallway, don't talk to her. Madeline shivered. Has she been here long? The landlady's gaze darkened. Longer than me. Madeline's room was small, but livable. The wallpaper peeled, and the air smelled damp. She was exhausted from her journey and collapsed onto the bed without changing. She awoke at 3:09 a.m. At first, she thought it was a dream, the whispering. Low, rhythmic, coming from the hallway. She held her breath. The whispers turned to laughter. Then knocking. Tap, tap, tap. Madeline's heart pounded. She turned to face the door. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Then it stopped. Silence. She exhaled, convinced it was her imagination. But as she rolled over, she saw it. A shadow standing just outside her window, watching. The next morning, she asked the other tenants about room 309. She never sleeps, an old man muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. She walks all night, listening, watching. Madeline frowned. But why? The old man's hands trembled. Because she wants someone to join her. That night, Madeline heard the whispers again. They were closer this time, just outside her door. She sat up, heart racing. The whispers were saying her name. Madeline. Then the door handle turned. Madeline couldn't move. The handle twisted violently, rattling, as if something was trying to force its way inside. Then, silence. She pressed her ear against the door. Nothing. Slowly, she turned the knob and peeked outside. The hallway was empty, except for her. The girl from room 309 stood at the end of the corridor, her eyes wide, unblinking. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the dim light. "Come play with me," she whispered. Madeline slammed the door shut. But the whispers continued. The landlady's face turned ashen when Madeline confronted her. "She's not a girl," she admitted. "Not anymore." Madeline's blood ran cold. "She was here long before this place became a boarding house," the landlady continued. "No one knows how she died, but she never left. Every few years someone disappears, and then she waits for the next one." Madeline swallowed hard. How do I stop her? The landlady's expression was grim. "You don't." That night, Madeline tried to stay awake. 3:09 a.m. A shadow loomed under the door. She covered her mouth, too terrified to breathe. Then, a whisper. "Madeline, you're awake." The door swung open. A pair of hands grabbed her. Madeline screamed. The next morning, the room was empty. Her belongings remained, but she was gone. The landlady sighed as she removed Madeline's name from the register. Room 309 was waiting for a new guest, and the girl who never sleeps still wandered the halls, listening, waiting, for you. The end. Story 6. The House That Breathes, a horror story. David and Claire had always dreamed of escaping the city. When they found an old Victorian house nestled deep in the countryside at an unbelievably low price, it felt like fate. The house was massive. 3 stories of dark wood and intricate carvings, standing alone on a mist-covered hill. The real estate agent was eager to sell, too eager. As he handed over the keys, he muttered something under his breath. "What was that?" Claire asked, frowning. The man hesitated before replying. Nothing. Just, the house has been empty for a long time. Some say it's alive. David chuckled, shaking his head. Ghost stories, nothing but superstition. Claire, however, felt uneasy as she stepped inside. The house was eerily silent, yet it carried an unnatural warmth, like stepping into the lungs of some unseen creature. Then the whispering began. At first, it was faint, like a breeze through old pipes. Then it grew, low, murmuring voices that slithered through the walls at night. Claire would wake up, gasping, convinced someone was speaking right next to her ear. "David, did you hear that?" she asked one night. David sighed, rubbing his face. "It's just the house settling. Old places make noise." But Claire wasn't so sure. The whispers sounded deliberate, and worse, the house seemed to breathe. Days passed, and strange things kept happening. The layout of the house felt wrong. Hallways seemed longer at night. Doors appeared where there had been none before, and sometimes Claire swore the staircase moved. One evening, she found herself lost in the second-floor corridor. She had walked the same path 100 times, but suddenly she had no idea where she was. The wallpaper seemed different, darker, damp, pulsing. She turned a corner and saw something that made her blood freeze. A door she knew hadn't been there before. Heart pounding, she reached for the handle, but a low, wet exhale rumbled through the house. The walls around her expanded, then contracted, like lungs. The house was breathing. She ran. David remained skeptical. "It's in your head, Claire. This place is old. Of course it creaks." But Claire knew better. Desperate for answers, she searched the house records at the local library. What she found turned her stomach. The house had once belonged to a man named Dr. Elias Grayson, an eccentric surgeon obsessed with the human body. He had experimented on living people, twisting their bones, stretching their flesh, fusing their bodies into the walls. The house wasn't haunted. It was alive. Claire returned home just as the sun dipped below the horizon. She found David in the basement, staring at something in the darkness. A wall, no flesh, stretched and quivering. Something shifted beneath it, pressing outward, as if trying to escape. Then a face emerged, not human, twisted, stretched, its mouth sewn shut. It opened its eyes and looked directly at them. David staggered back. Jesus Christ! The house shuddered. The ceiling groaned as if something huge moved within it. Then the whispers turned into screams. They ran, but the house wouldn't let them leave. The front door had vanished. The windows showed only darkness, no matter how hard they pounded. Then the house lurched, as if inhaling deeply. The walls rippled, twisting into grotesque shapes. Hands, faces, mouths frozen in silent agony. David grabbed Claire's hand. "We have to find another way out." But the house had already decided. The floor beneath them split open, revealing a yawning chasm of flesh and writhing limbs. The last thing Claire saw was David's face, wide with terror, before they both fell into the house's waiting maw. Days passed, then weeks, then months. No one came looking for them. The house stood silent on the hill, its wooden frame shifting ever so slightly. A new door appeared in the hallway, and deep inside the walls, two new voices joined the whispers. The house exhaled and waited. The end. Story 7. The Stranger at the Window. It was a quiet autumn night in the small town of Black Hollow. The wind howled through the leafless trees, rattling the windows of Claire Donovan's old Victorian house. She sat alone in her dimly lit living room, wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping on a cup of tea. The house was eerily silent. except for the occasional creaking of old wooden beams. Claire had moved to Black Hollow 2 months ago to escape the chaos of the city. She had inherited this house from her late grandmother, and though it was charming in a Gothic way, it also carried an unsettling aura, one she could never quite shake. As she settled in for the night, she noticed something strange. The curtains of her living room window were slightly open, and she could have sworn she saw movement outside. Her heart skipped a beat. The street was empty. She stood up, cautiously approaching the window. The darkness outside was thick, and for a moment, she thought she was imagining things. Then, just for a second, she saw him. A man standing in the shadows, his face obscured by the dim streetlight. Claire gasped, jerking back. When she looked again, he was gone. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her. Maybe it was nothing. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The next night, Claire was more cautious. She double-checked the locks, drew the curtains tight, and kept a kitchen knife nearby. But as she sat on her couch, reading a book to distract herself, she heard it. A tap. A single, deliberate tap on the window. Claire's body tensed. Slowly, she turned her head toward the sound. The curtains were drawn, but she knew someone was there. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. With trembling hands, she reached for the curtains, hesitated, then pulled them apart in one swift motion. Nothing. Her yard was empty. The street was deserted. But as she scanned the area, her eyes caught something horrifying. Footprints. Wet, muddy footprints on her porch, leading directly to her window. Claire's breath hitched. She stumbled backward, her mind racing. Was someone playing a sick joke? A stalker? A thief? She grabbed her phone and dialed the police. The officer who answered was kind but unconcerned. "There's no crime in looking through a window, ma'am," he said. "If he tries to break in, call us immediately." Claire hung up, frustration and fear bubbling inside her. She was alone, and someone was watching. For the next 3 nights, the tapping continued, always at the same time, 11:47 p.m. Each night, Claire sat frozen in fear, refusing to look, but knowing he was there. On the 4th night, she decided to set up her phone to record. If the police wouldn't take her seriously, maybe video evidence would. She placed the phone near the window and set it to record before retreating to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. The next morning, she hesitated before watching the footage. Taking a deep breath, she pressed play. The video showed the empty street, still and silent. Minutes passed. Then, movement. A shadow. A figure stepped into view, slowly approaching the window. Claire's blood ran cold. The man was tall, thin, and wore tattered clothes. His face, oh God, his face was wrong. His skin was stretched too tightly over his skull. His mouth twisted in an unnatural grin, and his eyes, hollow, dark, and empty. He didn't blink. He just stood there, staring through the window, as if he could see her. Then, without warning, he lifted a hand and tapped on the glass. Once, twice, 3 times, and then he turned his head, slowly, unnaturally, as if sensing something. He smiled wider, and then he spoke. "I know you're watching, Claire." The video ended. Claire dropped the phone, her entire body trembling. How did he know her name? She couldn't stay here. She grabbed her keys, rushed to her car, and sped toward the police station. The officers listened to her story, but when she showed them the footage, their faces changed. This isn't possible," one officer muttered. "We need to check your house immediately." A patrol car escorted her back home, but when they arrived, everything was normal. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, no stranger at the window, And worst of all, when she tried to show them the video again, the file was gone. "Maybe you need some rest, Mom," the officer suggested, clearly skeptical. Claire felt like she was losing her mind, but deep down, she knew it was real, and he wasn't done with her yet. That night, Claire sat in bed, clutching the knife. Sleep was impossible. At 11:47 p.m., the tapping returned, but this time, it came from inside the house. Claire's breath hitched. The sound wasn't at the window. It was at her bedroom door. Tap, tap, tap. Slowly, the doorknob twisted. Claire gripped the knife tighter, her body paralyzed in terror. Then, silence. The knob stopped moving. The tapping ceased. And then, in the darkness, a whisper. "I'm inside," Claire screamed. The next morning, the police arrived after a neighbor reported hearing screams. They found the house in perfect condition. No signs of forced entry, no intruders. But Claire was gone. The only thing they found was her phone, lying on the bedroom floor. The last video recorded at 11:47 p.m. It showed Claire sleeping. Then the door creaked open. A shadow moved into the room. A hand reached toward the camera. And then, darkness. Claire Donovan was never seen again. But every night at 11:47 p.m., the new owners of the house swear they hear a faint tapping at the window, waiting, watching for the next victim. The end. Story 8. The footsteps in the hallway. Emma never believed in ghosts. That was until she moved into the old Victorian house at the edge of town. It was a beautiful but decaying structure, abandoned for years before she bought it at a ridiculously low price. The locals whispered about strange occurrences, but Emma brushed them off as superstitions. She lived alone, enjoying the solitude until the noises began. At first, it was subtle. Soft creaks in the floorboards, the occasional flicker of the lights. But then came the footsteps. Every night, around 2 a.m., she would hear them. A slow, deliberate pacing in the upstairs hallway, right outside her bedroom door. The first night, she assumed it was the house settling. By the third night, she was certain someone or something was walking in her hallway. Determined to prove herself wrong, Emma set up her phone to record. She left the camera running overnight, positioned to capture the hallway. The next morning, she hesitated before pressing play. The video started normal. Silence. Then, at exactly 2 a.m., the sound of footsteps, but the hallway was empty. She rewound, played it again. The footsteps were loud, clear, but there was no one there. Dread pulled in her stomach. That night, she stayed awake, clutching a flashlight. At 2 a.m., the footsteps came again. Slow, heavy. She felt the vibrations through the wooden floorboards. Taking a deep breath, she yanked open the bedroom door. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps, they hadn't stopped. They were right behind her. The next morning, Emma sought answers. She visited the town's archives, digging into the house's history. What she found sent chills down her spine. The house had belonged to the Holloway family in the early 1900s. The father, a man named Victor Holloway, was a well-respected doctor until his young daughter, Annabelle, mysteriously vanished. The case was never solved, but whispers suggested she never left the house. Emma found an old photo of the Holloways. Her hands trembled as she studied the faded picture. The little girl's eyes seemed to bore into her. That night, she could barely sleep. The footsteps came again, louder this time, as if whatever walked the halls was growing impatient. At 2:15 a.m., her bedroom door creaked open on its own. Emma held her breath, paralyzed. The room was dark, but she could feel it, a presence standing just beyond her bed. She reached for her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on a pair of bare, dirt-stained feet. A child's feet. Heart hammering, Emma aimed the light higher. A girl stood there, wearing a tattered nightgown, her face pale, her eyes hollow and black. Annabelle Holloway. The girl opened her mouth, but no words came out, only a horrific guttural whisper. "Help me." Emma bolted upright, scrambling away, but the girl didn't move. She simply stood there staring. The air grew thick, heavy, suffocating. The whispers turned into anguished cries, echoing through the room. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, Annabelle vanished. Emma knew she had to end this. If Annabelle was trying to communicate, then there had to be something left unfinished. She scoured the house, searching for clues, until she noticed the hallway floorboards. One section felt loose. With shaking hands, she pried it open. The stench of decay hit her instantly. Beneath the floor, wrapped in rotting cloth, was a small skeleton. Annabelle had never vanished. She had been murdered, buried right beneath the hallway where her spirit still walked. Emma barely had time to process when the room grew ice cold. A whisper, soft and relieved, brushed against her ear. "Thank you." The weight in the air lifted. The footsteps never came again. But sometimes, late at night, Emma swore she could still hear the faint laughter of a little girl, finally at peace. Story 9. The Smiling Shadow. Ethan Carter was no stranger to ghost stories. As a journalist specializing in the paranormal, he had spent years debunking urban legends, spending nights in supposedly haunted houses, only to walk away unimpressed. But something about Ashbourne Manor unsettled him. The stories that surrounded the place weren't like the usual folklore he encountered. They didn't just involve ghosts or creaking floorboards. They spoke of something else, something intelligent, something that watched and waited. The legend was simple. Those who entered Ashbourne Manor and saw the smiling shadow would never be the same again. Some went missing. Others were found wandering the woods, unable to speak. The few that could talk only repeated the same chilling phrase, "It's smiling at me." Ethan had heard enough. It was time to uncover the truth. With his camera bag slung over his shoulder and a flashlight in hand, he drove through the dense fog-covered forest, following the crumbling road that led to Ashbourne Manor. As he approached, the mansion loomed through the mist like a decayed skeleton. It was enormous, its Gothic architecture clawing at the sky. Windows were shattered, and vines wrapped around the stone like strangling fingers. Ethan parked, stepping out into the cold night air. The forest was too quiet. No crickets, no wind, just an oppressive silence. He took a deep breath and approached the towering front doors. They creaked open before he even touched them. Something was already waiting for him inside. The air inside was thick with the scent of rot and mildew. Dust floated in the dim light of his flashlight. The grand foyer stretched before him, its once lavish decor now reduced to ruins. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals covered in thick cobwebs. Ethan pressed record on his camera. Ashbourne Manor, October 13. Locals claim this place is cursed. Let's see if there's any truth to it. His voice was steady, but his stomach churned with unease. A long hallway stretched ahead, lined with old portraits. Their eyes seemed to follow him as he moved. The wooden floor groaned under his steps. Then he saw it. A mirror, tall and cracked, leaning against the far wall. At first, it reflected nothing unusual, just Ethan, standing alone. But then, a smile appeared behind him. His blood ran cold. He spun around. Nothing. Just empty darkness. He turned back to the mirror. The smile was still there. A shape stood behind him, its face obscured by shadow, except for its mouth, stretching wide in an unnatural grin. His breath came in sharp gasps. His instinct screamed at him to run. But something compelled him to stay. The shadow didn't move. It just watched, smiling. Then the lights flickered, and the whispering began. The whispering came from all around him, slithering through the air like a voice inside his head. Ethan. He whipped around, shining his flashlight into the darkness. His own name echoed back at him in a mocking, breathless tone. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch, twisting unnaturally. The walls pulsed as if they were breathing. The mirror was no longer reflecting him. It showed someone else. A version of himself, but distorted. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale and stretched too tightly over his bones. His lips curled into that same impossible smile. It's smiling at me. The voice in his head grew louder, overlapping into a chorus of tortured whispers. He backed away, heart hammering. He needed to leave. But the house had other plans. The door he had entered through was gone, replaced by an endless hallway. Shadows slithered across the floor, moving against the light. Then, something stepped out from the darkness. The smiling shadow. It was taller than any human. Its body elongated and draped in unnatural darkness. Its limbs were too long, fingers stretching like skeletal claws. And its face, its grin was the only feature visible. Wide, unnatural, full of too many teeth. It didn't move toward him. It didn't need to, because the darkness itself was moving. The walls began closing in. The shadows crawled toward him like living creatures. The air grew thick, suffocating. He ran. His footsteps echoed through the endless corridors. No matter where he turned, the mansion warped around him. The portraits on the walls now showed the same thing. His own face, each one contorted into a wide, terrifying grin. His flashlight flickered. The shadows stretched, reaching for him. Then, he tripped. His camera clattered to the floor. The screen flickered. And then he saw it. The camera was still recording. And through its lens, he saw the truth. The smiling shadow wasn't chasing him. It was inside him. His reflection on the screen grinned, moving independently from his actual face. He reached up, touching his cheek. His lips were curling against his will. The more he struggled, the more his own face twisted into that same horrific smile. It's smiling at me. The whispers were now his voice. Something was taking over. And then, the lights went out. Ethan woke outside the mansion. The first thing he noticed was the silence. The house loomed behind him, untouched. His camera was beside him, the battery drained. He grabbed it, fingers trembling, and played back the footage. It showed the entire night, his terror, the shadows, the smile. But in the final frame, he was staring directly into the camera, his expression blank. And then, slowly, he smiled. The screen cut to static. His hand shook as he touched his own face. And then, his lips curled into a grin, wide, unnatural. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop smiling. And deep in the woods, inside Ashbourne Manor, something laughed, waiting for the next visitor. The end story 10, the door that shouldn't be there. It started on an ordinary evening, in a house that had never felt strange before. David and Lisa had just moved into their new home, a quaint old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. The house was affordable, almost suspiciously so, but they dismissed their doubts. They were eager to start a new chapter of their lives. One night, while David was unpacking in the basement, he noticed something odd. The room was supposed to have only 3 walls and a staircase leading up, but there it was, an old wooden door at the far end. The strange part, it wasn't there when they moved in. "Lisa," he called, his voice slightly unsteady. Lisa arrived, wiping her hands on her jeans. "What is it?" David pointed at the door. "Was that always there?" Lisa frowned. "Number, definitely not." They both stood staring at it. The wood looked ancient, darker than the other doors in the house. No dust, no cobwebs. Just there, like it had always existed. David hesitated but reached out and touched the handle. It was cold. "Maybe it leads to another storage area," Lisa suggested. "There shouldn't be anything behind it," David murmured. He'd studied the house's blueprints before they bought it. There was no mention of another room. Despite every instinct telling him not to, he turned the handle. It wasn't locked. And then he opened it. The door swung open silently, revealing a pitch-black space beyond. No furniture, no windows, just emptiness. David clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls made of something rough and damp like stone. The air was stale, carrying a faint metallic scent. "This doesn't make sense," Lisa whispered, stepping inside beside him. Their footsteps echoed in an unnatural way, like the sound was being swallowed by something. David aimed the light at the walls. Strange symbols were etched into the stone, deep and jagged, like they had been scratched in desperation. Some looked like eyes, others like mouths. Then the whispering started. Software, indistinct. Lisa grabbed his arm. "Did you hear that?" David nodded, his grip tightening on the flashlight. The whispering grew louder, surrounding them, though there was no one there. The walls seemed to shift, like they were breathing. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. Lisa yelped and spun around, yanking at the handle. It wouldn't budge. David pounded on the wood. Hey, open up." The whispers turned into a low, guttural laughter. The flashlight flickered. Then, from the darkness ahead, something moved. A figure emerged, tall, hunched. Its limbs too long for its body. Its skin was pale and stretched, as if it had been wrapped too tightly over its bones. It had no eyes, only a wide, gaping mouth filled with jagged teeth. Lisa screamed as the creature scuttled toward them, its hands scraping against the stone walls. David grabbed her arm and pulled her away, deeper into the room. The air grew colder. Their breath turned visible. The walls narrowed, as if the space was closing in on them. The creature laughed. "This isn't real," Lisa whimpered. "This isn't real." But it was. David saw something up ahead. Another door, identical to the one they had entered through. He didn't stop to question it. "Run!" he shouted. They sprinted, the creature's footsteps slamming against the stone behind them. The door was just a few feet away when Lisa tripped. David turned, reaching for her, but she screamed, her body being dragged backward into the dark by unseen hands. "No!" David lunged, grabbing her wrist. She was crying, struggling, but the darkness was swallowing her, pulling her down. David held on with everything he had. "Lisa, I won't let go." But then, she whispered, in a voice that wasn't her own, "It's okay, David. Let me go." His grip faltered. For a moment, just a second, he hesitated. And that was enough. Lisa vanished into the black. The door ahead burst open, a blinding white light spilling through. David was pulled forward by something unseen, and he fell through. David hit the floor hard. He gasped, lungs burning. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the basement. The strange door was gone. Lisa was gone. Everything was silent. For days, He searched. He called the police, hired investigators. No one could explain how Lisa had disappeared. There was no record of the extra room, no evidence of the door ever existing. But David knew, and at night, when he tried to sleep, he would hear it, a whisper, a soft, distant laughter. And sometimes, in the silence of the dark, he would hear Lisa's voice, calling from beyond the walls. "David, let me out." Months passed. David never moved out, never stopped searching, but there was nothing to find. Then, one night, he woke up to a sound, a knock, slow, rhythmic, coming from the basement. His body went cold. He knew what it was before he even stood up. With shaking hands, he made his way downstairs, and there it was, the door, right where it had been that night. The knocking continued. David pressed his ear to the wood. "Lisa?" he whispered. Silence. Then a voice, distorted, broken, barely human. "David, open the door." Tears filled his eyes. His fingers curled around the handle, but something in his gut screamed at him. "Don't open it." The knocking grew louder, more desperate. "David, please, it hurts. Open the door." His breath hitched. His mind screamed at him to run, but his heart. What if it was really her? His grip tightened. The whispers behind the door turned into laughter. And then, the door opened on its own, and something reached out. The last thing David saw was the darkness swallowing him whole. And then, just like that, the door was gone. The house fell silent once more, waiting for the next person to find it.